Sula by Toni Morrison, 1941, Chapter 10. The death of Sula Peace was the best news folks in the bottom had had since the promise of work at the tunnel. Of the few who were not afraid to witness the burial of a witch and who had gone to the cemetery, some had come just to verify her being put away, but stayed to sing, "Shall we gather at the river?" for politeness' sake, quite unaware of the bleak promise of their song. Others came to see that nothing went awry, that the shallow-minded and small-hearted kept their meanness at bay, and that the entire event would be characterized by that abiding gentleness of spirit to which they themselves had arrived by the simple determination not to let anything at all, not failed crops, not rednecks, lost jobs, sick children, rotten potatoes, broken pipes, bug-ridden flour, third-class coal, educated social workers, thieving insurance-men, garlic-ridden hunkies, corrupt Catholics, racist Protestants, cowardly Jews, slave-holding Muslims, jackleg preachers, squeamish Chinamen, Gloria, Dropsy, or the Black Page, let alone a strange woman, keep them from their God. So we see over here, everyone is so happy that Sula is dead. And remember, Sula was the person they were able to blame for all of their troubles, everything that went wrong. So Morrison's kind of artful in how she presents this opening scene of them being so happy, and then this very long list, which is one of your sentence models, of all these bad things, failed crops, rednecks, lost jobs, and showing how none of that, not even Sula, will stop them from God. In any case, both the raw-spirited and the gentle who came, not to the white funeral parlor, but to the colored part of Beechnut Cemetery, felt that either because Sula was dead, or just after she was dead, a brighter day was dawning. There were signs. The rumor that the tunnel spawning the river would use Negro workers became an announcement. Planned, abandoned, and replanned for years, this project had finally begun in 1937. For 3 years, there were rumors that blacks would work it, and hope was high in spite of the fact that the river road leading to the tunnel had encouraged similar hopes in 1927, but had ended up being built entirely by white labor, hillbillies and immigrants taking even the lowest jobs. So we're on page 151. But the tunnel itself was another matter. The craft work, no, they would not get that. But it was a major job, and the government seemed to favor opening employment to black workers. It meant black men would not have to sweep Medallion to eat, or leave the town altogether for the steel mills in Akron and along Lake Erie. So again, Sula's death is bringing hope. Good things are coming. The second sign was the construction begun on an old people's home. True, it was more renovation than construction, but the blacks were free, or so it said, to occupy it. Some said the very transfer of Eva from the ramshackle house that passed for a colored woman's nursing home to the bright new one was clear sign of the mystery of God's ways, his mighty thumb having been seen at Sula's throat. So it was with a strong sense of hope the people in the bottom watched October close. Then Medallion turned silver. It seemed sudden, but actually there had been days and days of no snow, just frost, when late one afternoon a rain fell and froze. Top of page 152. Way down the Carpenter's Road, where the concrete sidewalk started, children hurried to the sliding places before shopkeepers and old women sprinkled stove ashes like ancient onyx onto the new minted silver. They hugged trees simply to hold, for a moment, all that life and largeness stilled in glass, and gazed at the sun pressed against the gray sky like a worn doubloon, wondering all the while if the world were coming to an end. Grass stood blade by blade, shocked into separateness by an ice that held for days. Late harvesting things were ruined, of course, and the fowl died of both chill and rage. Cider turned to ice and split the jugs, forcing the men to drink their cane liquor too soon. It was better down in the valley, since, as always, the hills protected it. But up in the bottom, black folk suffered heavily in their thin houses and thinner clothes. So snow is something that's harder for them in the bottom because their houses aren't warm, their clothes are not fit for this cold weather. The ice-cold wind bled what little heat they had through the window panes and ill-fitting doors. For days on end, they were virtually housebound, venturing only out to coal bins or right next door for the trading of vital foodstuff. Never to the stores, no deliveries were being made anyways, and the items were saved for better paying white customers. Women could not make it down the icy slopes and therefore missed days of wages they sorely needed. The consequence of all that ice was a wretched Thanksgiving of tiny, tough birds, heavy pork cakes, and pivy sweet potatoes. By the time the ice began to melt and the first barge was seen shuddering through the ice skim on the river, everybody under 15 had croup or scarlet fever, and those over had chilblains, rheumatism, pleurisy, earaches, and a world of other ailments. So all these physical illnesses. Top of page 153. Still, it was not those illnesses or even the ice that marked the beginning of the trouble. That self-fulfilled prophecy that Shadrach carried on his tongue. As soon as the silvering began, long before the cider cracked the jugs, there was something wrong. A falling away, a dislocation was taking place. Hard on the heels of the general relief that Sula's death brought, a restless irritability took hold. Teapot, for example, went into the kitchen and asked his mother for some sugar butter bread. She got up to fix it and found that she had no butter, only oleo margarine. Too tired to mix the saffron color powder into the hard cake of oleo, she simply smeared the white stuff on the bread and sprinkled the sugar over it. Teapot tasted the difference and refused to eat it. This keenness of insult a mother can feel, the rejection by a child of her food, bent her into a fury that she beat him, as she had not done since Sula knocked him down the steps. She was not alone. Other mothers who had defended their children from Sula's malevolence, or who had defended their positions as mothers from Sula's scorn for the role, now had nothing to rub up against. So Sula's gone, there's nothing for them to kind of protect their kid from. The tension was gone, and so was the reason for the effort they had made. Without her, mockery, affection for others sank into flaccid disrepair. Daughters who'd complained bitterly about their responsibilities of taking care of their aged mothers-in-law had altered when Sula locked Eva away, and they began cleaning those old women's spittoons without a murmur. Now that Sula was dead and done with, they returned to a steeping resentment of the burdens of old people. So top of page 154. Wives uncoddled their husbands. There seemed no further need to reinforce their vanity, and even those Negroes who had moved into Canada from Medallion, who remarked every chance they got that they had never been slaves, felt a loosening of the reactionary compassion for Southern-born blacks Sula had inspired in them. They returned to their original claims of superiority. The normal meanness that winter brought was compounded by the small-spiritedness that hunger and scarlet fever produced. Even a definite and witness interview of 4 colored men and the promise of more in the spring at the tunnel site could not break the cold vise that lean and bitter year's end. Christmas came one morning and hangled everyone's nerves like a dull axe. Too shabby to cut clean, but too heavy to ignore, the children lay wall-eyed on creaking beds or pallets near the stove, sucking peppermint and oranges in between coughs, while their mothers stomped the floors in rage at the cakes that did not rise because the stove fire had been so stingy, at the curled bodies of men who chose to sleep the day away rather than face the silence made by the absence of Lionel trains, drums, crybaby dolls, and rocking horses. Teenagers sneaked into the Elmira Theater in the afternoon and let Tex Ritter free them from the recollection of their father's shoes, yawning in impotence under the bed. Some of them had the bottle of wine which they drank at the feet of their glittering Mr. Ritter, making such a ruckus the manager had to put them out. The white people who came into Christmas bags of rock candy and old clothes were hard put on the yes ma'am thank you out of their sullen mouths. Top of page 155. Just as the ice lingered in October, so did the phlegm of December, which explained the enormous relief brought on by the first 3 days of 1941. It was as though the season had exhausted itself, for on January 1st the temperature shot up to 61 degrees and slushed the whiteness overnight. On January 2nd, drab patches of grass could be seen in the field. So now the weather is getting warmer, January 1st, January 2nd. On January 3rd, the sun came out, and so did Shadrach, with his rope, his bell, and his tireless dirge. So remember Shadrach, he's known for having PTSD after the war and really struggling with that. He's known for his National Suicide Day, and he was a person who was believed to be the only one to see what Sula and Nell really did to Chicken Little. Shadrach, he, had spent the night before watching a tiny moon. The people, the voices that kept him company, were, with him, less and less. Now there were long periods when he heard nothing except the wind on the trees and the plop of buckeyes on the earth. In the winter, when the fish were too hard to get to, he did picking up jobs for small businessmen. Nobody would have him in or even near their homes, and thereby continued to have enough money for liquor. Yet the drunk times were becoming deeper but more seldom. It was as though he no longer needed to drink to forget whatever it was he could not remember. Now he could not remember that he had ever forgotten anything. Perhaps that's why, for the first time, after that cold day in France, he had beginning to miss the presence of other people. Shadrach had improved enough to feel lonely. If he was lonely before, he didn't know it, because the noise he kept up, the roaring, the busyness protected him from knowing it. Top of page 156. Now the compulsion to activity, to filling up the time when he was not happily fishing on the riverbank, has dwindled. He sometimes fell asleep before he got drunk, sometimes spent whole days looking at the river and the sky, and more he relinquished the military habits of cleanliness in his shack. Once a bird flew into his door, one of the robins during the time there was a plague of them. It stayed looking for an exit for the better part of an hour. When the bird found the window and flew away, Shadrach was grieved and actually waited and watched for its return. During those days of waiting, he did not make his bed or sweep or shake the little braid rug, and almost forgot to slash with his fish knife the passing day on his calendar. When he did return to housekeeping, it was not with a precision he had always insisted upon. The messier his house got, the lonelier he felt, and it was harder and harder to conjure up surgeons and orderlies and invading armies, harder and harder to heal the gunfire and keep the platoon marching in time. More frequently now, he looked at and fondled the one piece of evidence that he once had a visitor in his house, a child's purple and white belt, the little girl left behind when she came in to see him. Shadrach remembered the scene clearly, so pay close attention to this. He's recounting an important scene in the book. He had stepped into the door, and there was a tear-stained face turning towards him, eyes hurt and wondering, mouth parted in front in effort to ask a question. She had wanted something from him. Not fish, not work, but something only he could give. She had a tadpole over her eye. That was how he knew she was a friend. She had a mark of a fish he loved. And one of the braids had come undone. But when he looked at her face, he had seen the skull beneath, and thinking she saw it too, knew it was there and was afraid. He tried to think of something to say to comfort her, something to stop the hurt from spilling out of her eyes, so he had said, "Always." So she would not have to be afraid of the change, the falling away of skin, the drip and slide of blood, and the exposure of bone beneath. He had said "always" to convince her, assure her of permanency. Page 157. It worked, for when he said it, her face lit up, and the hurt did leave. She ran then, carrying his knowledge, but her belt fell off, and he kept it as a memento. It hung on a nail near his bed, unfrayed, unsullied, after all those years, with only the permanent bend in the fabric made by the long life of a nail. It was a pleasant living, with the sign of a visitor, his only one, and after a while he had been able to connect the belt with the face, the tadpole over the eye face he had sometimes saw on the bottom. His visitor, his company, his guest, his social life, his woman, his daughter, his friend, they all hung there on a nail near his bed. So we see over here, Shadrach has a very different view of what happened with Sula as a child than what she had, and he kind of views her as all of these different people in one to him, despite not really even knowing her, because of this immense loneliness that he personally feels. Now he stared at the tiny moon floating high over the ice-choked river. His loneliness had dropped down somewhere around his ankles. Some other feeling possessed him, a feeling that touched his eyes and made him blink. He had seen her again, months, weeks ago. Raking leaves from his hodge, he had gone into the cellar for 2 bushel baskets to put them in. In the hallway, he passed an open door leading to a small room. She lay on a table there. It was surely the same one, the same little girl's face, same tadpole over the eye. So he had been wrong, terribly wrong. No always at all, another dying away of someone whose face he knew. Top page 158. It was then he began to suspect all those years of rope hauling and bell ringing were never going to do any good. He might as well sit forever on the riverbank and stare out the window at the moon. By his day/calendar, he knew that tomorrow was the day, and for the first time he did not want to go. He wanted to stay with the purple and white belt, not go, not go. Still, when the day broke in the incredible splash of sun, he gathered his things, in the early part of the afternoon, drenched in sunlight, and certain that this would be his last time that he would invite them to end their lives neatly and sweetly. He walked over the rickety bridge and onto the bottom. But it was not heartfelt this time, not lovingly this time, for he no longer cared whether he helped them or not. His rope was improperly tied, his bell had a tiny, unimpassioned sound, his visitor was dead and would come no more. So we see over here that Shadrach had a very different idea of what this suicide day was supposed to be. He thought he was helping people by doing this. Years later, people would quarrel about who had been the first to go. Most people say it was the Deweys, but one or two knew better, knew that Desi and Ivy had been first, so that Desi had opened the door first and stood there shielding her eyes from the sun while watching Shadrach coming down the road. She laughed. Maybe the sun, maybe the clots of green showing in the hills promising so much, maybe the contrast between Shadrach's doomy, gloomy bell glinting and all that sweet sunshine, maybe just for a brief moment for once of not feeling free, of looking at death in the sunshine and being unafraid. She laughed. Upstairs, Ivy heard and looked to see what caused the thick music that rocked her neighbor's breasts. Then Ivy laughed too, like the scarlet fever that had touched everybody and warmed them down to gristle. Their laughter infected Carpenter's Road. Soon children were jumping about, giggling, and men came to the porches to chuckle. By the time Shadrach reached the first house, he was facing a line of delighted faces. Never before had they laughed. Always had shut their doors, pulled down the shades, and called their children up the road. It frightened him, this glee. But he stuck to his habit, singing his song, ringing his bell, and holding fast to his rope. The Deweys with their magnificent teeth ran out from number 7 and danced a little jig around the befuddled Shadrach, then cut into a wild ping of his walk, his song and his bell ringing. By now women were holding their stomachs and the men were slapping their knees. It was Mrs. Jackson, who ate ice, who tripped down the porch and actually marched along behind him. The scene was so comic the people walked into the road to make sure they saw it all. In the way, the parade started. Everybody, Desi, Tarbaby, Patsy, Mr. Buckland, Reed, Teapot's Mama, Valentine, the Deweys, Mrs. Jackson, Irene, the proprietor of the Palace of Cosmetology, Reba, the Harrods brothers, and flocks of teenagers got into the mood and laughing, dancing, calling to one another, formed a Pied Piper's hand behind Shadrach. Top of page 160. As the initial group of about 20 people passed more houses, they called to the people standing in the doors and leaning out the windows to join them, to help them open further this slit of the veil, this respite from anxiety, from dignity, from gravity, from the weight of the very adult pain that had ungirded them all these years before. Call them to come out and play in the sunshine, as though the sunshine would last, as though there really was hope. The same hope they kept them picking beans for other farmers, kept them finally leaving as they talked of doing, kept them knee-deep in other people's dirt, kept them excited about other people's wars, kept them solicitous of white people's children, kept them convinced that some magic government was going to lift them up, out, and away from the dirt. Those beans, those wars. Some, of course, like Helene Wright, would not go. She watched the ruckus with characteristic scorn. Others who understood the spirit's touch, which made them dance, who understood whole families bending their backs in a field while singing as one from one throat, who understood the ecstasy of river baptisms under suns just like this one, did not understand the curious disorder, this headless display, and so refused also to go. Nevertheless, the sun splashed in a larger and larger crowd that started, skipped, marched, and shuffled down the road. When they got down to where the sidewalk started, some of them stopped and decided to turn back, too embarrassed to enter the white part of town whooping like banshees, but except for 3 or 4, the faint-hearted were put to shame by the more aggressive and abandoned, and the parade danced down Main Street, past Woolworth's and the old poultry house, turned right and moved down to the New River Road. Top of page 161. At the mouth of the tunnel excavation in the fever pitch of excitement and joy, they saw the timber and bricks and steel ribs and tacky wire gate and glittered under ice stuck to diamond in the sun. It dazzled them at first, and they were suddenly quiet. Their hooded eyes swept over the place where their hope had lain since 1927. There was the promise, leaf dead, the teeth unrepaired, the coal credit off, the chest pains unattended, the school shoes unbought, the rush-stuffed mattresses, the broken toilets, the leaning porch, the slurred remarks, and the staggering childish malevolence of the employers, all there in blazing sunlit ice, rapidly becoming water. Like antelopes that leaped over the little gate, a wire barricade that was never intended to bar anything but dogs, rabbits, and stray children, and led by the tough and enraged and the young, they picked up the length of the timber and thin steel ribs and smashed the bricks they would never fire in yawning kilns, split the sacks of limestone they had not mixed or even been allowed to haul, tore the white mesh, tipped over the wheelbarrows, and rolled 4 plows down the bank, where they sailed out into the ice-bound river. Old and young, women and children, lame and hardy, they killed as best they could the tunnel they were forbidden to build. They didn't mean to go in, to actually go down into the lip of the tunnel, but in their need to kill it, all of it, to wipe from the face the work of the thin-armed Virginia boys. Top page 162. The bull-necked Greeks and the knife-faced men who waved the leaf promised dead, they went too deep, too far. A lot of them died there. The earth now warmed, shifted, and first 4 poles slipped. Loose rock fell from the face of the tunnel and caused a shield to give way. They found themselves in a chamber of water, deprived of sun, and had brought them there. With the first crack and whoosh of water, the clamor to get out was so fierce that others who were trying to help were pulled to their deaths. Pressed up against steel ribs and timber blocks, young boys strangled when the oxygen left to join the water. Outside, others watched in terror as ice split the earth beneath their feet. Mrs. Jackson, weighing less than 100 pounds, slid down the bank and met with an open mouth the ice she had craved all her life. Tar Baby, Jesse, Ivy, Valentine, the Herod boys, some of Ajax's younger brothers, and the Deweys, all, at least it was supposed their bodies were never found, all died there. Mr. Buckman's Reed escaped, so did Patsy and her 2 boys, as well as some 15 or 20 who had not gotten close enough to fall, or whose timidity would not let them enter as an unfinished tunnel. All while Shadrach stood there, having forgotten his song and his rope. He just stood there, high up in the bank ringing his bell. So we see that this is supposed to be like the National Death Day, and now these people who were so angry with this tunnel, they went in and they actually died. This is the end of chapter 10.